Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman. I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Scott Karasik. We are back this week to talk about the Atlanta Falcons' recent matchup in Week 14 against the Los Angeles Rams. We will also be talking about their upcoming matchup in Week 15 against the San Francisco 49ers. We'll talk a little bit about Robert Alford's contract extension and some other roster moves that have happened over the last week. And as usual, we will answer you guys' mailbag questions at the end of the show and throughout the show. So, Scott, as we usually do, we start the show talking about the roster moves. Couple of moves made today, some sort of quiet, upkeep moves. They re-signed Bleedy Ray Wilson, who was cut on Friday. They cut him on Friday to make room for Nick Williams to sort of get another body at wide receiver for last week's game. Then they cut him this week, but due to the injury to Jalen Collins, they brought him back in order to make room for Bleedy Ray. They cut Kevin Graff, who they brought up from the practice squad, as an insurance policy in case Jake Matthews didn't play. But Jake is back, so presumably that's not going to be an issue moving forward. You have any thoughts on these moves before we talk about the Alford contract extension?
I mean, it basically just says to me that Jake Matthews is probably fine at this point. He looked fine on Sunday. He's probably going to be fine this week. So I'm perfectly okay with cutting Kevin Graff. And Tom Compton even filled in a little bit this weekend when the Falcons were up 42-0. Heading into the fourth quarter, they're like, yeah, you can sit, Jake. And Compton filled in just fine. Graff was inactive, so I think it was just an emergency situation thing. Bleedy Ray Wilson, I think he is back, and I think that's a good thing because I think long-term he might be a good depth option. I don't think he was a good fit in his past stops for their scheme. He may be better in a press man, kind of like what he played in college, but I know not a lot of people like him. So it is what it is. As far as the whole Nick Williams move, I think there's another move coming. Nick Williams has a concussion. Either Mohamed Sanu is going to be healthy this week, Julio Jones is going to be healthy this week, or they're just going to roll with 4 wide receivers active. And that, I mean, basically their inactive list is going to be Bleedy Ray Wilson, Julio Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Nick Williams. Like, that's 4 of it right there. Adrian Claiborne, Wes Schweitzer, and then, pick a defensive back that is pick your 5th safety. So Sherrod Neesman or Robinson Threezy, whoever's unavailable or whoever's available is going to end up getting that spot. So I guess for that, to me, it's whatever. I'm not too worried about it. I mean, okay. It is what it is. I just think that unless they might have to do a pure putting Williams on injured reserve and then bringing back, I don't know, J.D. McKissick or someone like that for wide receiver if they really want to do that.
Okay. Well, we'll have to see what happens. I don't really have too many thoughts on this. I think Bleedy Ray at this point is just sort of a body in the sort of DeMarcus Van Dyke mold. With Kevin Graff, I think it's a positive sign for Jake Matthews that they felt comfortable enough to cut Kevin Graff. But I did notice that I think he did have a little bit of troubles against the Rams last week. It wasn't too big an issue in terms of sort of preventing him from being semi-effective. But there was several run plays, I thought several pass plays where it was very clear that he was struggling with the knee and he was struggling to move. But, having Tom Compton on the roster, I think, sort of gives them some depth there, so they don't really need a guy like Kevin Graff. But, basically these are sort of upkeep moves, nothing big, nothing major here. And we'll have to see if the Falcons continue to adjust the back end of the roster as we get down the home stretch. Now, let's turn our attention to the big news, which is that Robert Alford got a contract extension. which was a big surprise to myself because I've been saying for a year and a half basically that I didn't think he was going to get re-signed by the Falcons. So, I will concede that I was very wrong on that. But I do. It wasn't necessarily because I didn't think the Falcons should re-sign Robert Alford. I've been a big fan of Robert Alford. I've defended Robert Alford quite a bit on this show and other shows I've been on over the last couple of months. I think he's a good player. I think whatever money he would have gotten on the open market, I think he would have been well deserving of that money. So I think it's a good move for the Falcons. I just was a little surprised that the Falcons are going to basically be willing to commit all this money to the cornerback position, given that, Desmond Trufant is probably likely to get a contract extension of his own at some point next summer as well.
Pretty much. I mean, I like it. I thought it was the right move. I still haven't seen the full structure on it. It hasn't hit the database yet. So it's just one of those weird deals that you're hoping hits it sooner or later. I do like the idea of signing him now. I do like the idea of the $21 million guaranteed probably is the first 2 years of the deal. And then the third and fourth year probably prove it type. Like, hey, if he's still playing balls to the wall, have him at 31 years old, have him at 32 years old, cool. If he's not playing at the same level, that's when you cut him. But I don't think it'll be too big of a deal long term. He'll fit in just fine cap wise. Now, I don't love it as an idea of, oh, hey, Jalen Collins isn't ready. It might just be that they like Poole, they like Collins, they want to lock up all the depth that they have. And maybe Collins is only 23 years old. Robert Alford's 28. Even if Alford plays all 4 years, Collins will be 27 at the end of Alford's deal. Now, whether he's with the Falcons at that point, who knows? But it basically gives Collins 2 years to develop and say, hey, either you're the guy or you're not in 2 years, or we're going to keep you for after that point. So, yeah. I think that's what it says. And then Poole's one of those minimal risk type deals where if he sits on the bench and he's a fourth corner and he's a dime back, that doesn't really hurt his value. He's an undrafted free agent on a rookie minimum deal every single year of his contract, and his bonus was like $1,000 a year. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Brian Poole, so I don't want to sound like I'm knocking him. But let's not forget that the only reason he's a nickel cornerback is because the Falcons basically didn't go out and get a nickel cornerback this offseason. They didn't go out and re-sign Phillip Adams. That was a move we sort of expected them to do all summer long. Was at some point they're going to get a veteran cornerback to sort of compete for that open nickel spot for the first 4 weeks of the season when Jalen Collins was suspended. They didn't do that. Fortunately, Poole was able to play at a high enough level where they felt comfortable not having to do that. And so that's kudos to Brian Poole, but it's not as if the Falcons sort of were like, oh, yeah, we're committed long-term to sort of developing Brian Poole as our long-term nickel cornerback. Now, he may very well become that, and that will be played out over the next couple of seasons, as I suspect him and Collins will sort of compete for that role, particularly next season. If Poole isn't moved to safety, I think this move sort of works out. I don't think this is sort of, that some people have sort of construed it as we're giving up on Jalen Collins sort of move. As Scott broke down, the likelihood of the Alford contract, the way it's structured is probably it's all the guaranteed money is paid out in the first 2 years. That's generally how the Falcons do it. That's how most teams do it. This contract is very similar to the Sean Smith contract that the Raiders gave to him this past offseason. That was a deal where it was basically the first 2 years, all the guaranteed money is paid out. So essentially what happens is this is basically like a 2-year, $21 million deal, presumably. We'll get confirmation when the structure comes out. But more than likely it's a 2-year, $21 million deal. And that's 2 years of getting solid play from Robert Alford as a starter, presumably. That's 2 more years of Jalen Collins being probably the nickel cornerback if Poole or somebody else doesn't take that job, but most likely being the third corner on the team. And then at the end of that, if Jalen Collins is worthy of getting paid at the end of his contract a bunch of money, then the Falcons will pay him, probably at that point decide to part ways with Robert Alford, who'll be 31 and will have a pretty hefty salary at that point, probably some cap number close to $10 million. And, they'll move on and they'll swap one guy in and one guy out. Or, at that point, they might decide that, it's time to move on from Alford, and Jalen Collins hasn't sort of proven himself to be worthy of a starting spot at that point, and then they move in another direction. That's all a possibility as well. Obviously, that's something that is not going to really be of a major concern until 2 years from now. But I don't think people need to sort of look at this deal as we paid Robert Alford. That means we're giving up on Jalen Collins as a potential long-term starter. He may very well wind up winning that spot. And I also think the other take that came out of this deal was, oh, we paid Alford, that means we're not paying Trufant. I don't think that's the case at all. I know the pectoral injury sort of leaves a little bit of doubt in terms of the Falcons' willingness to pay Desmond Trufant, but I think at the end of the day, they're going to wind up, assuming that he doesn't have any setbacks over the next 6 months, that they're going to wind up paying him to make him one of the highest paid corners in the league because he's got, 3+ years of really strong play to say that he deserves that money. And so I do think this is a move where the Falcons have decided that they're going to give Alford this next 2 years. They're going to give Trufant the next 4 or 5 years, presumably. And, they're making a bold decision in terms of we want to solidify our defense, and we don't want to be put in a position where, we have to spend the next 2 years trying to find a replacement for Robert Alford, which was a possibility if Jalen Collins wasn't that guy. So, this is an indicator that the Falcons are not necessarily seeing the window close, but they're trying not to sort of have this situation where Matt Ryan has to spend the next couple of years playing with bad defenses because we don't have guys outside of Trufant that can cover anybody.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we answered those mailbag questions that a couple people asked about the Alford contract. Scott, you want
Actually, I do have one. I got one more thing on that.
Okay, I'll let you go.
So the signing of Rocky to that kind of money, if you put all the money in the corners, if you look at Seattle's defense, they have a big money corner and 2 big money safeties, and that's how they structure their cap. Atlanta's probably going to have 2 big money corners, and then strong safety is going to be big money until they really have to pay. I mean, strong safety is a rookie deal right now, so you don't have to worry about that. And Ricardo Allen's got a RFA deal coming up, so that's going to be like $3 million at most. So between those 2 spots, you're not paying them that much comparative. The only question is, hey, what happens if Allen leaves after next year? Then you might have to draft a free safety. What happens if the Falcons go and get a big money free safety? Then, you can't really pay Neal until you get rid of Alford. So it just depends on the money, the way the scheme is going to work. But as of right now, paying Alford big money for 3 or even 4 years isn't that big of a deal. It actually does make sense because you got 3 more years of Neal's rookie deal before his 5th year option kicks in. So I think it was a good signing.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about this Rams blowout. The Falcons won the game 42-14. It was a pretty dominant performance, particularly with the defense being able to generate 5 takeaways that allowed the offense to score 28 points off of those takeaways, not including including 2 touchdowns, one by Deion Jones on a pick 6, another one by Vic Beasley on a fumble return for a touchdown. And, the Rams offense, we knew they were bad. They were probably the worst offense in the league. And they looked like it for most of the game. They got some sort of garbage time points in the fourth quarter. But, I think the key for the Falcons defense, they can certainly say that they were able to sort of keep the Rams in check for mostly the first 3 quarters before they sort of took their foot off the pedal. The Rams only converted 1 of 8 third downs in the first 3 quarters. or up until like the end of the third quarter, I think was when they got their first third down conversion. So overall, a very solid performance, a very, I thought it was a pretty dull game in the first half, even though the Falcons were up like 21-0. But I think they sort of opened things up in the third quarter where we got all those points. So, I thought that was one of the highlights of the game, to see that, what has been the story of this 2016 Falcons team, which is their ability to dominate in the third quarter. Like you go back to that Eagles game, and to a certain extent the Chiefs game as well. Like many of these games that they've lost this year have been games where they've sort of struggled to win the third quarter matchup. But that's a very different change from previous Falcons teams who always seem to struggle in the third quarter. This team, technically seems to struggle in the fourth quarter more so than anything else, but that's usually because teams are playing from behind and are sort of up late in games and they sort of, dog it a little bit. But, I think the key matchup for the Falcons this past week was their ability to sort of control the Rams' defensive line. That's the strength of their team. They really sort of game planned with a lot of quick passing, a lot of short throws. I saw people complaining about the play calling in, live during the game. I thought that was people not understanding what Kyle Shanahan was trying to do, which was basically he was trying to prevent Aaron Donald from taking over the game. Aaron Donald played well in this game. He didn't take over the game. And I think that's a testament not only to Kyle Shanahan's play calling. I do think our guards, Chris Chester, played well. I think Andy Levitri played well. Got some help from Alex Mack to sort of keep Aaron Donald from really, doing what he could do. And so I do think it was an indicator of how well the Falcons game planned this game. I think, the indicator of how good the Rams defensive line is to see how they sort of put the clamps on the Falcons running game to a certain extent, particularly Devontae Freeman, who had like 6 yards or something ridiculous like that. And I think that,
it wasn't a good game for Devontae.
Yeah, and it's, and I think when you go back, at least when I went back and watched the film, a lot of it was because Aaron Donald was just disrupting plays, and basically Chris Chester had to deal with Aaron Donald being 3 yards in the backfield, which prevented him from being able to get those reach blocks on the linebackers, and then that allowed the linebackers to come downhill and be there waiting for Devontae in the hole, and sort of he didn't really get a whole lot going. Coleman had a little bit better game just because I think Coleman's speed was a little bit better getting to the edges and beating those linebackers to the edges and sort of getting a little bit more yards that way. But, I think it was overall, outside of that, it was a pretty solid performance for the Falcons offense. Nothing splashy, nothing sexy, but they did what they had to do, and they let the defense sort of carry the day.
And what's nice this week is they get to face the league's worst run defense in San Francisco. And when you got Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman and the Falcons' offensive line, and even Teron Ward was getting some yardage against the Rams, I think the Falcons could run all over San Francisco and really just run a couple of play actions here and there. But San Fran's run defense is garbage. It's the worst in yards per carry. It's the worst in yards. It's allowed, I think, the most touchdowns, or the second most touchdowns, the most touchdowns. It's just a bad run defense. So Atlanta needs to attack it. Atlanta's got, I'd say, an average rushing attack right now.
But I think they're much better than average, but
I mean, they're right around average. They've got the potential to break out and have 200-yard games, but at the same time, they can also have a bad day against a good defense. So maybe they're above average, but above average versus crap should look like world beaters, should look amazing. Basically, it should be the Falcons' defense against the Rams version of the running game, where the Falcons' defense just looked ridiculous against the Rams. If they could play against everybody the way they played against the Rams, Atlanta would never lose another game under Dan Quinn this year.
Yeah, it's possible.
Do I think that will happen? Probably not, just because I'm being realistic. However, I'm okay with that as long as they're showing improvement, and I think they are showing improvement. So I think Atlanta has a very good shot this week. Freeman had a bad game. I think he's probably the only guy on the roster that you could say had a bad game this week.
That's probably fair, yeah.
I mean,
some people might say Eric Weems had a bad game, but
I'm so glad his contract ends after this year. Eric Weems is a good gunner, don't get me wrong. But I think you could find a college safety who played gunner in college who could do exactly the same thing Weems does, and you just keep him on the roster. And you just throw him on the roster, and he'd give you exactly the same thing.
I think the Falcons thought that way once upon a time and then tried Drew Davis to do that, and it didn't work out quite to the same degree. So
Drew Davis wasn't a bad gunner. I like Drew Davis. He wasn't the issue. It was the guy on the other side.
Okay. I think there's a tendency that people sort of think special teams players are sort of a dime a dozen. And I would say by and large, most special teams players are a dime a dozen. But I think Eric Weems is on a different level in terms of his ability and coverage that I don't think you're just going to go down the street and find someone who can do what he can do. And I think that's why he's played, 9 years in the NFL and caught maybe like 10 passes. And it's all because of how good he is on special teams. So,
and he has no business being a returner anymore.
I think
give me his averages all you want, but he makes so many stupid decisions in the return game of when he just, it's frustrating. He'll call for a fair catch on the 5. He'll call for a fair catch on the 8 when he could let the ball go out or at least try and force him to make a play on it. I don't get it. I've never been a fan of a returner who does that. I don't. It just doesn't make sense. Because if you let the ball go, you have the ball at the 25.
Look, I can't really defend his decisions, but the thing I'll say is he's been doing that ever since he's been in Atlanta. And, it doesn't really hurt the team all that much. Like, yeah, it's a stupid decision. Like, oh, come on, Eric Williams, you're killing us with this, now we got to go 95 yards instead of, 75 yards or whatever it is. So, on an individual case-by-case basis, it seems like it's the worst thing that ever happened in the world, but it's not really that big a deal. It screws up your field position on a couple of drives, but it's never really hurt this team to any great degree. I think it's one of those things that it frustrates people. I get it. I understand it. It's frustrated me at times, but it's not a big deal. It's whatever. I mean, he's really been doing it for since the dawn of time. And it didn't hurt us in 2009. It didn't hurt us in 2010. It didn't hurt us any of those years. So it's no big deal. You got anything else you want to talk about with the Rams game, or you want to move on to the 49ers game?
Other than Vic Beasley and Deion Jones kind of saying it was a statement game for both of them, I think, as a, hey, we're here. We at least deserve to be in the conversation. Not saying they should be the winners, but if you don't at least get a vote for Vic Beasley for Defensive Player of the Year, if it ended today, I'd be like, what are you thinking, man? What's going on here? And Defensive Rookie of the Year, I do think Deion Jones should be right up there. Again, may not be the winner, but if he doesn't at least get your third place vote, what are you thinking, man?
Okay. I know, surprise, surprise, I'm not as sort of high on the let's get these guys awards bandwagons at this point. I think Deion Jones is having a solid rookie year. I think the problem is there aren't a whole lot of other great candidates to sort of say, yeah, is he third on the list? Yeah, probably, because, outside of Chris Jones and Joey Bosa, I can't really think of any other defensive rookies that are really, tearing it up this year. But, if anybody who's voting for that award votes for Deion Jones over Joey Bosa at this point, I would tell that person they're smoking crack because Joey Bosa's been much better at this point. And it's the same thing sort of with Vic Beasley. Like, I get, he's leading the league in sacks at this point, if I'm not mistaken. And so I understand why that sort of leads people to believe that he's, in the conversation. But, I don't think anybody who's objective thinks Vic Beasley's had a better season than Von Miller has had. So it's like, if Vic Beasley can continue to pad these sort of multiple sack games and he winds up finishing the season with like 18 or 19 sacks or something like that, then I think we can have that conversation. But I think at this point, he might be in the top 5, but he wouldn't be in the sort of, I think if anybody voted for Vic Beasley for Defensive Player of the Year, they were secretly a Falcon fan and hadn't been watching football anybody else play this year. Because, I think the other guy that we played this week, Aaron Donald's had a better season. I know he doesn't have the gaudy stats to say it, but, because he only has 6 sacks or whatever, or 7 sacks. But, he's been dominant player this year, a lot more consistent than Vic Beasley has been. Same thing with Von Miller. But, I know people will say you're just a Vic Beasley hater just because I don't give him credit for being the best player in the league. I don't think he's that, but I think he's a very good player.
I'm not saying he's the best player. I'm saying he deserves to be in the conversation for the award this year. Looking at the numbers, looking at the season, it'd be tough to be like, oh no, he doesn't belong there.
That's what I'm like. I don't think he really belongs there. Like, that's why I'm saying, like, if he continues to play like he's played the last couple of weeks for the next 3 weeks, then yeah. But if we're being honest, he's only really had like 4 games where you've been like, oh my God, Vic Beasley, did you see what he did that on Sunday? Like, outside of that, the other 9 games, not to say that he didn't do anything, but you're not looking at, like, you wouldn't have watched those other 9 games and been like, Vic Beasley's by far the best player in the Falcons defense. For most of the season, I think most people would have agreed that Adrian Claiborne was the team's most consistent pass rusher. And then all of a sudden we want to be like, Vic Beasley's is in the conversation for Defensive Player of the Year, where for half the season he wasn't even the best pass rusher on his team. I don't know. That's why I'm a fan of Vic Beasley, but I think some of the Vic Beasley hype train is going a little bit too far with some of that stuff.
All right. Whatever. well, I'll just be like, I'm not going to convince you on this, so I'm just dropping it because we got to get on to this 49ers game.
All right, let's talk about this 49ers team. You talked a little bit about it, Scott. They are 1-12. They have a really bad defense. It is not a recipe for success when you play the Atlanta Falcons, who happen to have a pretty decent offense, I think most people would agree.
And they might be the worst team in the league, even over the Browns.
I wouldn't go that far. I think the 49ers are a little bit better.
The 49ers got a lucky win in the first week of the season against the Rams, who just got their coach fired, and then have been utter garbage since.
I don't quite agree with that. I think the 49ers are a little bit more competitive than their record indicates. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they're not one of the 3 or 4 worst teams in the league, because they are. But I do think, the one thing that you can say about the 49ers, they remind me a lot of like the 07 Falcons, which is like they can be competitive for about a half, and then at some point, Sidney Rice or Adrian Peterson decides, oh, we're going to go out and win this game. And that's their lack of talent is really hurting them basically like in the second halves of games. Like, they'll keep it close. They'll keep it within 1 score at halftime, and then the other team winds up winning again. They should have won on Sunday.
So like the 2013 Falcons, really.
I don't know if the 2013 Falcons were that competitive, to be honest with you. Maybe when they had a healthy Julio, like the first 5 weeks, but after that point, they kind of
5 weeks Julio was healthy before the offensive line kind of died.
Yeah. The early and when that 2013 team had a receiver not named Harry Douglas as a number 1 receiver, that's probably where they are sort of at. They should have won on Sunday against the Jets. If Phil Dawson had not missed 2 field goals, 2 makeable field goals, they would have been up 23 to like 3 in that game, and the Jets wouldn't have been able to come back on them.
And the Jets are just as bad as they are. So being like, yeah, they're competitive against the Jets, and the Dolphins is like the only decent team they've been competitive against. Their one-score games are to the Cardinals.
They were in the game with Miami for a while.
They were in the game with Miami. They were kind of in the game with Dallas for like a half.
They went 3 quarters. They went toe-to-toe for 3 quarters with the Saints. I mean, like, look, I'm not trying to sit here and act like the 49ers are good or anything. I'm just saying, like, I don't think they're terrible. That's all I'm saying. Like, they're a bad team, but they're not terrible. They're not like pulling your hair out. Yeah, they're not like I wouldn't think, like, if you watch the Jaguars play, you're slitting your wrist after you watch a Jaguars game. I don't think you're doing that if you're watching the 49ers play.
That might be the most poorly coached team in the entire NFL.
Now that Jeff Fisher's gone, I think that you probably have a pretty good argument for that.
Okay, Rams are definitely the most poorly coached team in the NFL. After the Rams,
yeah,
I'd say the Jaguars. I think the Browns are actually a decently coached team. They just have no talent on that roster.
Yeah.
And they have no quarterback. And the NFL is a league where the quarterback has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the 49ers are in a similar boat. They're not devoid of talent, but Carlos Hyde is good. That's about it, though. You look at the 49ers going into this week, they're potentially going to be missing Torrey Smith, who had a concussion on Sunday. He's questionable for this week. He's in the concussion protocol. So I think this is his second concussion this year. So
something like that.
Yeah. So it doesn't, it's not likely. I wouldn't think it's likely that he'll play this Sunday after your second concussion. But, the other key injury I think is Joe Staley, the left tackle. He's dealing with a hamstring injury. He missed that 49ers game. They started the great Zane Beadles at left tackle as a replacement for him. Staley's day-to-day, so whatever that means, maybe he'll play this Sunday. But if he doesn't, and they wind up starting Zane Beadles at left tackle again, I think this is going to be a big day for Dwight Freeney if that happens.
I mean, if they're putting 3 guys on Vic Beasley, Freeney might have 4 sacks. People might go, holy shit, when did Freeney get back?
Yeah, definitely. And they're already missing some. They lost their center, Daniel Kilgore, for the season. They put him on IR today. So they're starting Marcus Martin there, who was their starter last year. He was terrible last year, which is why Kilgore got the job. I think Marcus Martin didn't even make it through the whole season before he got benched. Basically, he's their Peter Kahns, as if we're, comparing it to the past bad Falcons lines. So it's a pretty favorable matchup for the Falcons up front, similar to what it was with the Rams, particularly if Staley's out. If Staley's in, it's still a favorable matchup for the Falcons, but it's a little less favorable because they at least have one competent starter on their offensive line. And Beatles won't be terrible at left tackle. He'll be okay at left guard.
Trent Brown can't handle speed. You notice that when a guy can't handle speed, and I pointed out, the very next week, Beasley seems to destroy him. But that's just the truth. The guys who can't handle speed are going to just get demolished by Beasley. Unless they have help. And Trent Brown can't handle it.
I think it's going to be interesting with Trent Brown and the Beasley matchup because I do feel like the 49ers plan is going to be we're going to run it right at Vic Beasley and we're going to let Trent Brown, massive 375-pound frame, run right at Vic Beasley, and that's going to wear him down, and then he won't be as an effective pass rusher. And the 49ers run game is the best strength of their team. But obviously there's a certain point where the Falcons offense can sort of essentially take this game over and make the 49ers have to abandon the run more so because I don't have a lot of respect for the Falcons run defense in terms of stopping Carlos Hyde. So I think what's going to end up happening.
I do if they stick with what they were doing this weekend. They were putting Jackson and Hageman out there, like they did last year. Had their biggest bodies out there, and then had Jackson, Hageman, Grady Jarrett, and Brooks Reed as the defensive line in run situations, and it was working decently. I mean, yeah, you're going to give up some runs to Gurley, but they held Gurley to 3.8 yards a carry. They held Malcolm Brown to 3.5 yards a carry. The issue wasn't, I mean, yeah, you're going to get a couple chunk runs here and there, but it wasn't all day. They weren't getting run on all day. On 20 attempts that were running back attempts, they allowed 75 yards. That's a pretty decent day. The issue they had was on the reverse. They got kind of killed there. And then Jared Goff ran in a touchdown in garbage time. I don't even remember that play. Like, it was garbage time. I was half paying attention to that play.
Yeah, Philip Wheeler screwed up on that play.
Yeah.
I disagree. I think the run defense was pretty poor on Sunday. I think sort of looking at yards per carry and looking at the total yards sort of skews the numbers to a certain extent, where people think the run defense was better than what it was. You go back and you look at those 1st and 10s. They pretty much anytime they handed the ball off to Gurley, he was getting 6 or 7 yards, which isn't a huge chunk of yardage. But it's one of those things where it's like now you're getting into these favorable situations. And you look particularly early in that game, a lot of the third downs that the Rams did not convert. And I think that's a testament to the Falcons' pass defense stepping up and also Jared Goff being terrible, is that they got a lot of 3rd and 3s and 3rd and 2s and sort of these makeable third downs that if the Rams had a semi-competent quarterback, if the Rams had a semi-competent offensive line, that they probably would have converted a bunch of those third downs. And the third down defense has been pretty bad for the Falcons throughout this season. And I think a lot of it has to deal with sort of the myth of them having a good run defense. The Rams are the worst run team in the league, and they were able to really be effective moving the ball and staying on schedule offensively with their running game against the Falcons' run defense. And so my expectations is if the Falcons' offense gets off to a slow start, the 49ers are going to just pound the ball down the Falcons' throats, because they had 240 some odd yards against the Jets last week, and the Jets have the Jets defense isn't anything to write home about, but it's a much better run defense than the Falcons have. So, look, I think that's a situation not to sit here and be like, it's all doom and gloom, like, oh, and the 49ers are going to rush for 250 yards and beat us. I'm just sitting here saying, like, I think the offense is going to take care of business, the Falcons offense that is. But I do think that's a weakness that this team – I think the run defense is the biggest weakness on this team. And I think the base defense has really been bad this year, not getting pressure on the quarterback, and now they're not stopping the run. We know the nickel defense ain't stopping the run. So it's one of those things where, like, that's this team's Achilles heel, but fortunately they're playing these bad teams, and the offense is able to has been essentially masking this Achilles heel for most of the season because of how many points they get up early in games and teams being forced to play from behind and throwing the ball a lot more in the second half.
I'm not worried about it. Especially if Joe Staley and Kilgore are out. I don't think the 49ers can actually run on the Falcons with those two guys out.
Okay. Well,
I mean, those are their best 2 offensive linemen, if we're being fair.
That's fair.
Without those 2 guys, I think they're basically fucked.
Well, they had those guys. They weren't having those guys last week, and they had 250 yards. So clearly, they're not that terrible at it. But
they were going against the Jets.
And the Jets' run defense is better than the Falcons.
The Jets are just bad as a whole, though. The Jets don't have the offense to force a team to pass. The Jets don't have a run offense.
I agree with you on that. Like that, I'm sitting here saying, like, pound for pound, the one area of this game where the 49ers have an advantage over the Falcons is running the football, because the Falcons' run defense is god awful, and it's been masked by the fact of how good our offense is. That's the point I'm making. So now, again, before anybody accuses me for propping up the 49ers like they're this formidable challenge. I do expect the Falcons offense to take care of business, and it's not going to be that big a deal. I'm just saying, in the first quarter of the game, before the Falcons start blowing out the 49ers, pay attention to how many yards Carlos Hyde is getting. Pay attention to whether or not Carlos Hyde is getting 5. If we're seeing a lot of 2nd and 5s and 2nd and 4s as opposed to 2nd and 8 or whatever. Because while the 49ers don't have the horses to sort of pound the ball down the throat on the Falcons and win that way, we'll probably play some teams in January that do. So that's something that people need to pay attention to. That's all I'm saying. Now, let's talk about the Falcons' injuries. We're not the healthiest team either.
No, we're not, which Claiborne being out isn't helpful. Julio Jones, I would say, is probably out. Teresi, if he's out, he's out. It's whatever. He's a special teamer and backup safety. Sanu, Ishmael, Sanu, and Collins are the 3 that I think probably will end up playing. I think Williams might end up going on injured reserve if need be, just because it's concussions you don't want to mess with, and he took a shot.
Yeah, that he did.
I thought Maurice Alexander legitimately broke his neck on that play because he was just laying there not moving for about 5 minutes.
Yep. Hopefully Maurice Alexander doesn't suffer any sort of long-term issues with that, but that's what happens when you lower your head and don't hit what you see. That was a very dangerous and scary play. I was a little nervous there. But hopefully, everything works out for all those guys.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, we did get a mailbag question about Julio's injury. Big Boy Brewski asked, knowing DQ in his reports, how bad is Julio's injury?
I wouldn't expect him to come back until maybe the Carolina game. I said that, last week? Don't play him if you don't have to the next 2 weeks because you got the horses to take out the 49ers and the Rams. And if you've already locked up the division, which they haven't locked up the division yet, but if they can win the next 2 weeks and Julio doesn't play the next 2 weeks and they go into the final game of the season 10-6 or 10-5 and the division's locked up, I hate to say it, I'm okay with resting Julio to close the season out. You don't really need him against the Saints. I don't think the Saints team is that good, and I think by that point it won't really matter.
Okay. I think that game might be a shootout, so I think having Julio there would be beneficial. But you might be right. We'll see. Maybe this defense actually is going to start stopping people. I think there's probably a better chance that Julio plays this week than there was last week. I didn't think he was going to play at all last week. I never really bought into the whole, we expect him to play stuff that Dan Quinn was saying last week. I think there's a decent chance that, at least a 5% more better chance that he'll play this week. But probably in all likelihood, if it's close, then I think the Falcons, as Scott said, and I think I said as well, if it's close, you don't need to sort of risk him sort of aggravating that issue because the turf toe is not something that just sort of heals over 10 days and you're good to go. This is going to be an injury that he's going to be lingering with for the rest of the season going into January. And it's just going to be about whether or not he can sort of tolerate it to a certain extent and still play at a high level. We know he's a gamer, so I don't have any doubts that once he gets on the field, he'll be able to be an effective player. But, against this 49er team, I don't think it's necessary, particularly if Sanu comes back. It does sound like Sanu's a lot more likely to come back this week. So having, one of our starting receivers out there this week, I think will be beneficial. And I don't think we really need Julio because, again, as we talked about, the 49ers run defense is pretty bad, and I think the Falcons can sort of rely on the running game this week to carry the day. Okay. Some of the key matchups, I think. We already talked about them. The run game, offensive line. Yeah, I think the pass rush is going to be key here. I do think, as Scott said, we can get after Colin Kaepernick. I think the best way of sort of corralling mobile quarterbacks is getting pressure on
think
them.
Gabbert actually played most of last game.
No, Kaepernick started and played the whole game.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't watch a lot of it. That's why I was like,
Yeah, I thought Gabbert until I watched the game, I thought Gabbert played, and then I watched the game and I was like, oh, Kaepernick did play last week because I remember all the talk the week before last that Kaepernick was going back to the bench.
What the hell happened to him?
Colin Kaepernick?
Yeah, he was so good in 2012, and then just downhill since.
It wasn't that good, but I remember getting into it with 49er fans back in 2012 because I remember writing a preview of that NFC Championship game where I was like, Colin Kaepernick's very inaccurate, and he's really good because he's how mobile he is, and sort of his receivers make these ridiculous catches that make him look better than what he actually is. He's good throwing the ball down the field, but other than that, he's really bad or very erratic. And basically, what's happened is he's gotten the good has basically disappeared, I think, in terms of the aspects of his game. And so therefore you're just left with a lot of the bad. And so therefore you have a pretty below average quarterback that's inaccurate. But he still can be dangerous. He's still got the legs. He's still got the arm strength. So he can hit a couple of throws and make a couple of runs that can hurt you. But not enough to the degree where you're like, oh no, we got to play Colin Kaepernick this week. So that's a far cry from what it used to be. You got anything else to add on the 49er game, Scott, or you want to get on to the rest of the mailbag?
I mean, it's a pretty cut and dry kind of game, just like last week's was. Atlanta should win. Atlanta should win by 10 points or more.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about this game. I do think it'll be a little bit more competitive than last week's game, just because, as I said earlier, I do think the 49ers are good enough to keep it competitive for a quarter or two, probably the first half, and then at that point the Falcons will probably blow the doors off of it and make it similar to some of these other games. Like the Tampa Bay game, the Thursday night game, I think is a good example of what you might expect this game to be. That was a relatively close game in the first half, and then the Falcons dominated from that point on.
And if it's exactly like that game, there's going to be a lot of very happy Falcons fans come 7 o'clock on Sunday night.
Yeah. All right, guys, let's get on to the mailbag questions. Our first one comes from Abraham Lewis. He asks, thoughts on Vic? Why is he not talked about much in the media? The kid's a fucking wrecking machine.
He's not talked about much in the media because, I mean, I don't know what to say. Was John Abraham talked about that much when he was in Atlanta?
No.
Was anybody ever really talked about when they were in Atlanta? I feel like the only guys that get talked about in Atlanta are Roddy White, Julio Jones, and Matt Ryan. And I think if you're in any other city, you really have no idea who any of the rest of the guys are, unless you play fantasy football and you got Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman, and they're just lighting it up for you, depending on the team they play against.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's Atlanta, and you don't get talked about very much when you play for the Falcons, unless your name is Julio Jones or Matt Ryan. I wouldn't even Roddy White wasn't. I remember back in Roddy White's prime, we were talking about Roddy White. He's one of the best receivers in the league, and no one ever talked about him as one of the best receivers in the league. So, yeah, I just think that's sort of the nature of playing for the Falcons. I also think the fact that the Falcons' defense has not been very good this year sort of it's a lot easier to overlook Vic, just because the entire team has not really been playing great defense, and so his contributions are sort of overlooked in that way. And I think a lot of it is what I said earlier. I think he's been, he's had these really monster games like he had this past Sunday, and you've heard a lot more people talking about him now over the last couple of days than you probably heard up to this point in the season. But there's been a lot of games, particularly early in the first half of the season, where he wasn't doing a whole lot, to garner media attention, at least national media attention. Not to say that he wasn't playing well, but it wasn't just like, you weren't seeing these sort of monster games like you see from other guys. And I think that's sort of contributing to it. I think, if he continues to rack up sacks, which I think there's a very good chance he'll do that this week against Trent Brown, then I think you're going to hear a lot more people talking about him, particularly as the Falcons get down the stretch run into the postseason. Okay, we got a couple more Vic questions. Matt Starr asked, what, if anything, are or will teams do to slow down Vic? Chip, etc.? Who do you see on the defensive line taking advantage?
I mean, just like any other speed rusher, coming off that side, you want to throw a tight end out there. You want to chip them. You want to have running backs come up and chip them. I thought New Orleans probably did the best at it. Vic was still getting pressure at times during that game, but they would have a running back basically line up in an H-back kind of spot and chip them and then run out for a route. And I think that's going to be a very common thing you'll see in the New Orleans game that the Falcons play at the end of the year. I think they'll run that play pretty much with that formation pretty much every play just to kind of keep them at bay. Outside of that, there's a lot you can do. You could just have another guy back there and be like, hey, we see Beasley come off the edge, clock him. But for the most part, there's only so much you can do to stop the whole line. You can't commit 3 guys to Vic Beasley and then hope that the rest of the line wins their one-on-ones if you've got a shitty line like what the Niners will have this week with all the injuries, or what Carolina throws out there every week. Because with Ryan Khalil out. So I don't think we'll see that much. I think the Saints probably will have the best situation against the Falcons to close the season out. And even they might have some trouble. So, yeah, I mean, it's just not a very good group of offensive linemen that the Falcons are going to play the last 3 weeks of the season. So if they can get up early, you might see a couple of multiple sack games for Vic to close the season out. And if Aaron's like, well, he might have to finish with 19 or 20 sacks, he might just finish with 20 sacks. I'm not saying he will, but I'm saying it is very possible that Vic Beasley could end this season with 4 straight games of 2 to 3 sacks each. And people go, holy shit, that dude just came on right before the playoffs. And that would make Atlanta a very scary team to face in the playoffs, especially if they end up winning out, especially if the Seahawks and the Lions lose at least 1 or 2 more games each, and Atlanta ends up as the number 2 seed. Coming to Atlanta with how loud the dome can get, and I know people are going to be like, well, the pumped and sound, blah, blah, blah. That dome can get loud. We saw it in the 2012 playoffs. That dome can be ridiculously loud.
I was there. Yeah, so it gets loud.
It gets loud. You got Vic Beasley coming off one end. You got Dwight Freeney coming off the other. You got Grady Jarrett, who hopefully turns on in the next couple of weeks and gets a sack or 2, and people are like, oh, shit, we got to guard the inside. Hopefully Claiborne comes back and he's back to what he should be. And that could be a very scary interior and a very scary defensive line to go against pretty much any play.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to answer Matt's question, I think teams will probably start chipping a little bit more. I do think you'll see teams trying to run at him a little bit more just to sort of wear him down and not allow him to sort of pin his ears back. But again, as we discussed earlier, that sort of depends on whether that team is in a advantageous to run the football. If you're down 21 points, you're not going to really be relying too much on the running game. So I do think you'll probably see – now, normally you would probably expect an interior pass rusher to benefit because, having speed off the edge allows quarterbacks to step up in the pocket, which should then have him step up into the arms of someone rushing from the interior. So you would assume Grady Jarrett should benefit the most from Vic Beasley's play. The thing I did notice, though, on Sunday against the Rams is Dwight Freeney probably should have had 2 sacks in the game. The first sack strip that Vic Beasley had, Greg Robinson held Freeney, and basically Freeney beat Beasley to the quarterback, but because of the holding call, he got knocked into the ground, and then Beasley hit Goff from behind to get the sack strip. And then later in the game, there was a time where Freeney beat Robinson on an inside move, and then Robinson pushed him in the back to force him wide of Goff. They didn't blow the flag on that. They should have called him for a block in the back, but they didn't. And that was another sack that Freeney should have had if not for Greg Robinson cheating. So probably more than likely Freeney's going to be the guy that benefits just because he seems to be the guy that's doing the most at this current time other than Vic. But potentially you could see Grady Jarrett and maybe even Hageman if he continues to get reps inside. Benefit from him.
That's one thing I wanted to talk to you about. I saw that in this past game against the Rams. They were lining Hageman up as a one technique, basically saying, take all of your thoughts out of it, just attack the gap in front of you. Just attack the A gap. Just bust right through it. That's your job. That's all you have to do. And I feel like he did well with that. I know it's a simplification of his job, but I feel like that might be his best possible role moving forward.
I mean, they used him on the interior a couple of times against the Chiefs. It didn't really sort of do a whole lot. He had a couple of nice plays here and there. I do feel like some of his pass rushing ability against the Rams was because the Rams guards are so bad. So I'll be curious to see if he does it again against the 49ers and particularly against Carolina and New Orleans if he continues to get those opportunities because their guard play is certainly a lot better than the Rams guard play. But yeah, like Roger Seinfeld dropped off of a cliff because even Jonathan Babineau and Courtney Upshaw were beating him with speed. And, not to say Babineau's slow, but we know Upshaw's not fast. And Babineau's at this point in his career where he's, a pressure from Jonathan Babineau comes once in a blue moon. And so I do feel like probably it's not a coincidence that Hageman also had his best game as a pass rusher when those two other guys were feasting. I do think Hageman, I need to see more. I don't have really a take yet. I just need to see more.
I'm just saying when he came out of college, I kept saying this guy needs to be a one technique, just line him up, let him get after the quarterback, use his explosion up the line. If it's two coaching staffs who have now been like, hey, he's a 5-tech, hey, he's a 5-tech, and then they're finally playing him inside, I mean, does nobody watch this kid play in college? That's all he did in college. That's how he got drafted in the second round. That's where he wins, is busting off the line. Yeah, he needs Brian Cox's foot shoved in his ass every now and again because he's an idiot. He's a dumbass off the field. He's an asshole in practice, I'm sure. But if that's what he does well, use him there.
I don't want to nitpick here, but like when he's lining up in a nickel, he's not really lining up at a one technique. He's lining up at a 3, a 4, a 2. It's all over the place. There's no real technique to it. It's just line up on this side of the defensive line, and sometimes it's a 4 technique, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 2, and then just get after the quarterback. I think in terms of his ability to play one tech, I never liked his ability on the inside. He's too tall, he's too long. And he's not a player that plays low. And I think that gets exposed, and I think that's one of the reasons why this coaching staff moved him out to DN. I know people have been disappointed with his play this year, but I personally think he's played much better this season than he's played any other year, at least on a snap-to-snap basis overall. So I don't really agree that playing him at one technique is.
I'm not saying one technique in the base. I'm saying one technique in the nickel. Play him as that more interior defensive end in the nickel. Now, in the base, keep him at end. Keep him where he's at. But, I mean, why not try and use him as a slow, big-ass version of Michael Bennett? Not saying he's close to Michael Bennett, but a slower, just giant version of that. See if you have something in that role. It might even help your run defense in the nickel because he can penetrate. When he's on, he can penetrate. He can at least cause double teams to open up some guys when he's in the nickel.
Maybe. I say I need to see a little bit more before I go too far on one end on that.
All right.
Okay, Markel Jefferson asks, who does Vic Beasley compare to in the league or in Falcons history?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. In Falcons history, I can't think of anybody who Vic Beasley really does compare to in Falcons history. He's not as tall and long as John Abraham was. He does have the same kind of prowess to knock the ball loose that Abraham had. But I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to say the closest in the NFL in terms of a stylistic matchup is probably Cliff Avril. I think that's probably his best stylistic comparison. I think in terms of just raw athleticism, he and Von Miller are right on the same page in terms of raw athleticism. In terms of everything else, I mean, you got a guy who can do it all and is starting to break out, and I just want to see more growth because I think if we see him with 2 sacks a game to close the season out, I mean, where really is his ceiling?
Yeah, Avril's the guy that I've always compared him to, even when he was coming out at Clemson, when everybody else was comparing him to the Bruce Irvins and the Von Millers of the world. Avril's the sort of player. I think he's well on that way in terms of where his potential is, in terms of being a guy that wins with speed, wins with his first step. Cliff Avril, maybe not so much now, but certainly when he first got to Seattle and towards the end of his days in Detroit, he had one of the most devastating first steps in the league, at least in my opinion. And he was a guy that consistently would win with speed, not a whole lot of power, not a whole lot of other things to his game, just sort of, I'm just going to run right past you, and that's how I'm going to win. And I think that's basically what Vic Beasley has sort of turned into. I think Beasley has improved his power. We've seen a little bit more power this year than we've seen in previous years, and certainly than what I saw in his days at Clemson. But I don't think we're ever going to really see Vic Beasley be that sort of power, the guy that's going to jack up offensive tackles on a consistent basis. And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't quite put him on the same level as guys like Justin Houston and Von Miller and even Khalil Mack, who I do think can more consistently win with their power.
It did take Avril a couple of years to really develop his power, though, because he came in as about a 235-pound guy, and it took him a couple of years to really bulk up, fill his frame out, while still maintaining that speed.
Yeah, but like the point I'm making is like when you go and you watch Cliff Avril even today, like you don't, like not to say that he never uses power, but that's not really what he wins with. Like he wins with speed, and power is a small aspect of his game, but it's not something that he goes to in his repertoire very often. And that's the point I'm trying to make about Vic Beasley, where a lot like Avril, I think he's going to be a guy that's, 90% of the time he's going to win with speed or counter moves off of that speed. And then like 10% of the time he might use power to sort of, and it's usually only going to be against like bad tackles, not like Von Miller can beat Mitchell Schwartz with his power. I don't think Vic Beasley's going to be able to beat Mitchell Schwartz with his power. I think that's the difference. Okay. Markel Jefferson's next question is, who would best fit opposite Vic Beasley?
Man, if I could pick anybody, absolutely anybody.
Go ahead.
I'd have to go with JPP. I think that would be the perfect complement opposite Vic Beasley. He's got the speed. He's got the power. He's someone who bends the edge. You can get that pincer movement and force guys up into the pocket. You've got a guy who can create 10 sacks by himself. So when you got two guys who I think they're creators. You got creators and you got cleanup guys. Ray Edwards in Minnesota, that was a cleanup guy. He couldn't be a cleanup guy here for whatever reason. But that's what he was. And then you got, your John Abrahams, you've got your Simeon Rices of the world who create sacks. That's JPP. You got guys like Vic Beasley and Cliff Averill and Von Miller. Again, all completely different kinds of guys, all creators. They create their sacks. So I think you got two creators on the outside. I think you're going to get cleanup on the inside. If you get pressure from just penetration and some pressure from guys like Jarrett and maybe even Hageman, and that'll be your pass rush group, I think you could destroy teams with them together.
I don't have a specific name. JPP is a pretty good name. So, if you want someone specific, Markel, then I don't got anything for you. I haven't gotten to that frame of mind in terms of, we need this player or that player in terms of who I would put. But the type of player I would want, like, to me, ideally in the future, the future I'm envisioning is we'll get to a point where Vic Beasley's not just rushing from the left, he's rushing from the right. And basically, whether it's Beasley or this other guy, we have an edge rusher similar to what John Abraham was in his last years in Atlanta, which was Abraham would line up to the side of the defensive line where he thought he had the most favorable matchup. So if he wanted to go against Zach Strief, he'd line up against Zach Strief. I can't even remember who the Saints left tackle was back then, but whoever that guy was. I can't remember who it was before Armstead was. Was it? Oh, it was Bushrod. Bushrod.
Yeah, Jermon Bushrod.
Yeah.
He lined up against Bushrod more often than not.
Yeah, no, because obviously Bushrod is the the guy between Zach Strief and Bushrod. You're going to line up against Bushrod. But I do remember.
And John Stinchcomb was the other guy that they had.
But I remember that game. Yeah, I guess it was late in 2012 where we beat the Saints, where Breeze had the 5 picks. And Strief was beat up that week. And basically, every chance John Abraham had, he lined up against Strief, and he just was beating him like a drum. And then occasionally he would kick over to the other side, and then Croy would line up against Strief, and he would beat him like a drum. So it was one of those things where it's like, I think like that's what I want to see Beasley become, where it's basically, okay, this week Trent Brown or Zane Beatles. In this situation, it doesn't really matter. But, like, who do you want on this down, Vic? You line up on this side, and you beat that guy. And so basically what you want for the guy opposite is you want a guy who's just as versatile, who can line up on either side of the defensive line and has the speed to beat left tackles, but also has the power to beat right tackles. Obviously, that dichotomy between left and right tackles isn't as strong as it used to be, but you still sort of see it from time to time. And so, like, I would prefer a guy who's quick, explosive, but also has length, a little bit more length than Vic Beasley has. So, JPP does fit that mold.
And he's
so a player
can rush from both sides.
He can. So he's a good name. So when you say his name, it's like, yeah, a guy like that, preferably a guy with more than one hand. But basically a JPP type with more than one hand, basically.
If you want a couple names from the college ranks, I really like T.J. Watt, J.J.'s little brother, for that kind of role. I like Derek Barnett for that kind of role. Barnett's not as explosive off the line, but I think he's a very good athlete, would fit in well. McKinley out of UCLA, he's not as long, or he's not as tall, but he has really long arms. Some of these guys, they may not be 6'5", but they definitely have the length that you need. And then, oh man. I mean, obviously, if you can get Myles Garrett, you get Myles Garrett, but I'm just trying to be more realistic here. And, God, who else? Devontae Fields. That'd be the other guy. Although I think Devontae Fields is probably not going to be a Falcon because of his off-field extracurriculars. And I know Aaron probably wants the short guy, Ewan Price out of Pittsburgh, to come to Atlanta.
I wouldn't mind him. I wouldn't mind him at all.
He's kind of got that Elvis Dumervil build to him.
Yep.
That like 5'11", 250-pound bowling ball off the edge, which I'm perfectly okay with. If you can pass rush, you can pass rush. I loved Aaron Donald. I loved Grady Jarrett. I loved Vic Beasley. To me, it's more about technique and speed than raw, unadulterated length. Now, don't get me wrong. I, just like everybody else, had a super high grade on Jadeveon Clowney. Because I'm not an idiot here. But let's be honest here. There's a lot of really good ways you can win with pass rushers. And there's a lot of really good ones in this coming draft. And there's a lot that have not declared yet.
Yeah, definitely. David V. Kano asks, why has our running game been so mediocre this season? What's up with Free barely playing against the Rams?
I think Freeman barely played against the Rams because they were trying to figure out early in the game which scheme works better. And I feel like they were running more with a gap scheme than a true outside zone, because that's what was working better. And that may just be what Kyle Shanahan does from here on out. What scheme works better? Against the Chargers, both worked. Against the Rams, it was the gap scheme, so it was more Coleman. Why not throw more out there? Keep running the ball, keep throwing the schemes out there, and just whatever sticks, and go with that. Go with the guy who runs it best, and go with that. You got two good running backs. I mean, you got a Pro Bowler in Devontae Freeman, and you got a guy who is arguably the next Darren Sproles and Tevin Coleman. So just go out there, and whatever sticks will stick.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to why Freeman only got a couple of reps against the Rams. I disagree with the premise that our running game has been mediocre this season. I think our running game has been very good. I think part of the reason why our numbers aren't as high is because we've played some of the best, run defenses in the league. We play some really good defensive lines, and it's hard to run for 100 yards against the Seahawks. It's hard to run for 100 yards against the Eagles and some of those teams. But I do think, I think part of it is we probably give Tevin Coleman too many carries. You can make that argument. If we just gave Devontae Freeman 20 carries a game, I think our numbers probably would be a little bit higher. But, I think our running game is fine. It's not like elite, but I also think, maybe part of it is sort of this expectation that you go back to the first half of last season where our running game was amazing, but then it sort of basically that first 6 games that Devontae started, he was the most productive running back in the NFL. And then after that, the Falcons had what essentially was the league's worst running team. And what has happened this year is, I guess, you've seen sort of the middle. They're just okay, they might not have the heights to the same degree that they had at the beginning of last season. They've had a couple of games like that. But they're also not as bad as they were towards the end of last season. So you're seeing a little bit more of, the average there. And I don't think that's mediocre. I think that's sort of normal, and I think it's healthy. And I think our running game has been a lot more effective than maybe other people seem to think it has been. Matt Stars asks, I know the Bucks are in the way. However, would you rather play the Giants or the Skins in round 1 of the playoffs? We got a couple of playoff matchup questions. I guess I'll throw the other one out there too. Damon also asks, of the current playoff teams, can you rank teams in order of who you would most like to play, to least like to play?
So I think for the Falcons playoff matchups, I would rather play the Skins because I don't think the Skins are that good. I don't honestly know if the Skins make the playoffs. Between the Giants and the Bucks, I don't know where the Skins would fit in. In terms of the teams I'd most like to play, I'd most like to see the Falcons get a bye in the first round. But if they can't get that, hopefully Minnesota somehow makes their way in, because I think Atlanta would destroy them. Hopefully they can somehow play Seattle in the Georgia Dome, because I think without Earl Thomas, Atlanta stands a way better chance of beating the Seahawks. I don't really mind the matchup with Detroit, and I think Atlanta could beat Dallas. I don't think the NFC is as strong as it really looks. There's really not a matchup outside of maybe the Giants that really is like, oh man, I think Atlanta's going to have a hard time with this.
Yeah, I mean, what Scott said about rather playing the Skins versus the Giants, I'd much rather play the Redskins than the Giants. You know, I've said multiple times, I think Dallas and Seattle are the two toughest matchups for us. I put the Giants up there as well without Desmond Trufant and their defense playing as well as it has. I think the thing that has slowed down this Falcon team more than anything else is playing good defenses, particularly good defenses that have good defensive lines that can win up front. And that is a sort of when you can slow down this offense and basically when you prevent this team from scoring 30 points, they don't win very many games. Or like 1-4 in games where the offense hasn't scored at least 30 points or something like that. So basically, if you have a good enough defense that can basically say, oh, we're only going to give up 27 or 28 points to the Falcons, and you have enough on offense to basically score 27 or 28, and, you know, a lot more teams have that than probably not, because we saw Kansas City and Philadelphia sort of put points on us and they were quote unquote mediocre offenses. So the Giants probably would be third on terms of who I would least likely want to play. Am I going in the right order? Most likely. Okay, I'm going backwards. So I guess probably Detroit, probably Tampa Bay. Detroit, Washington, Tampa Bay, Minnesota, Green Bay, then probably the Giants, then Dallas, and then Seattle. So that was probably the order of most likely want to play to least likely want to play. Markel Jefferson asks, should the fan base be afraid of a first-round exit if Aaron Rodgers comes back to Atlanta as a wild card?
That's the game I don't want to see. I'm hoping the Packers just miss the playoffs, honestly, because I don't want to see them again. I'm tired of Green Bay in the playoffs. I feel like every big Falcon story, oh, Vic went up to Green Bay to win that game. Can we have a storyline that doesn't include them in the playoffs?
Yeah, look, I think the Falcons are a good team, but they have some flaws. So you need to have a healthy fear of pretty much every playoff team, because if they're good enough to make the playoffs, they're good enough to beat the Falcons. That's not to sit here and say that the Falcons shouldn't be expected to win against multiple opponents. But yeah, like if we have to play Green Bay again, it's not as if we blew them out the last time we played them in Atlanta.
It also goes the other direction, though. If they're in the playoffs and the Falcons are in the playoffs, the Falcons are good enough to beat them.
Oh, no doubt about it. I don't think that's without saying. There's, as you said, there really are no really strong teams in the NFL, period. There is no elite team. And so the Falcons are in a position where they can make a deep run if they start playing, well in the postseason. So I don't want to sound like, the Falcons are somehow, this team that can't do anything. But I do think, no one should be looking at any of these teams as if, oh, they're a cakewalk. We've already lost a game to Tampa Bay. They obviously aren't a cakewalk. They have what it takes to beat us. They've done it before. So it's not as if, if we played them in the playoffs, do I think the Falcons will win that game? Yeah. But would I sit here and be like, oh, no, Falcons are just going to roll through the box and they're going to, no, I wouldn't say that, because they've already beaten us. So, I do think, yeah, if we play the Packers again, you should have a healthy fear because we barely beat them last time in Atlanta. So, but, I don't think Aaron Rodgers in particular puts that much fear into me more so than some of these other teams. But because the Packers offense is clicking a lot more and clicking probably more now than it was a couple of weeks ago when we played them, you know, they're a little bit scarier than they were. So, sure. Be a little bit afraid. Speaking on that note, Markel Jefferson's next question is thoughts about a potential matchup with Tampa Bay in the playoffs.
I think Atlanta can win as long as they play disciplined defense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think we're the better team at this point, but Tampa Bay's defense is playing a lot better. And as I just said, you know, the key to beating the Falcons is you got to slow down their offense. And if you can, you know, catch this defense, which is pretty inconsistent, to say the least, a couple of times like they did in that Week 1 game, you can beat the Falcons.
Yep.
That's how the Chiefs did it. You know, that's how the Philadelphia Eagles did it. That's how the Chargers did it. So, you know, it's a winnable game for both teams, but I do think the Falcons are the better team. Damon's question. Oh, I already answered that question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Markel Jefferson asks, I believe free safety and strong safety are very important positions to the scheme, seeing what happened with Seattle on Sunday.
I mean, that goes without saying. Most teams, they can kind of skate by with average or worse safeties. The Patriots are one of the best teams at skating by with average safeties, although lately they've been focusing a little bit more on that with McCourty back there. But Seattle, without having Earl Thomas, just they look like garbage out there. And it could just be that his backup is awful, but Earl Thomas is what made that defense what it was.
I would agree with that to a certain extent. I do think, you know, being as good at defense as they have been historically over the last couple of years, I think it owes a lot to Earl Thomas. But I think that's the difference between being a historic.
Aaron? I have no idea. I think Aaron kind of froze up there. So what he's saying is that historically good defenses, like what Seattle has, what they play, they are a little different than because they've got those guys like Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. It makes them a better defense. It makes them a much better defense. Let me re-add Aaron to this. Going down with the next question. I believe the fan base thinks Ricardo Allen is bad because he doesn't make as many splash plays as he did this year. That's from Markel Jefferson. I mean, that goes without saying. It's very obvious that the fan base has an issue with Ricardo Allen because he's not making those splash plays. I'm guilty of it myself. He's an average safety, below average safety in that area. He's not great, but he's also cheap. So you kind of get what you pay for there. Dirty Bird 45 asks, who will win the Defensive Rookie of the Year? And that's a tough question because you got so many good players. You've got Deion Jones, you've got Keanu Neal. Both are going to be in the conversation for it. They may not win it, but they'll be in the conversation for it. You've got Leonard Floyd, who has 7 sacks and is looking like arguably one of the best guys out there. Oh, there's Aaron. You back?
Yeah, my internet, so I had to switch over to phone. My internet decided didn't like me talking about Earl Thomas.
Yeah, we were talking about Earl Thomas. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, I was saying, like, I think people look at the score and they're like, oh, man, Seattle really missed Earl Thomas. But I do think there were a lot of some extenuating circumstances that didn't necessarily mean that Seattle's defense, gave up all those points. It was, when you turn the ball over 6 times, it's gonna be hard to win those games. Okay, let's see if we can get to the next question.
Markel Jefferson. I answered that one. I believe the fan base thinks Ricardo Allen is bad. That one?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll answer it. Yeah, I think that's the main reason. I've been saying that for weeks. So, I think Ricardo Allen's been fine. I don't think this defense needs a great free safety to be good. I think it probably needs a great free safety to be great. But, we need to be more concerned about being good before we worry about being great. I think more of the issues have been because of the front sevens not being able to take care of business more so than Ricardo Allen's issues on the back end this year. Okay. Next question is from Dirty Birds 45. He asks, who will win Defensive Rookie of the Year?
And I said Deion Jones and Keanu Neal should have an argument there. You can make an argument for Leonard Floyd. You can make an argument for Joey Bosa. There's quite a few guys you can make an argument for.
I think Bosa's going to win it. I think I saw somewhere where I think he has as many pressures as Vic Beasley has, but has played like 3 less games and probably a lot less snaps. So I think that's sort of a testament to sort of how well Bosa has been playing this year.
I don't know. I think a linebacker who can return 2 touchdowns and has 3 picks and 10 passes defended and is second in the league for rookie tackles might sway some voters.
Yeah, I'm sure, all of them, live in the state of Georgia. But yeah, I don't think Deion Jones is going to win it. I'm sure he'll certainly get a lot of love in Atlanta over these next couple of games, and if he continues to play at a high level and make some, highlight reel plays, I think he'll get more recognition. But I don't think he'll wind up winning the award when it's all said and done. Same guy, Dirty Birds 45 asks, who has had a better season, Debo or Keanu?
This may not be a popular answer, but I think Debo's had a better season. I think he's had some plays where there's some situations where, yeah, he had hit the rookie wall a little bit, but I think in coverage he's been better. I think as an overall player he's been better. He's taking on a little bit more responsibility in the defense. And it's just kind of all catching up, and it's kind of all clicking for him now. So I think Deion's had a better season so far. Now it's like 1-1A kind of deal. Out of all the rookies, those 2 are definitely our best. But, I mean, you're looking at 2 guys who could easily be cornerstones for the future.
I think it's Keanu. I think what happens is when Keanu messes up, and he has quite a bit this year, it's much more obvious because it's, him missing a tackle in the open field. It's him, doing whatever other mistakes he's made this year. And so it's more glaring when he messes up. I think with Deion, it's been a lot of small mistakes that he's made that don't really show up unless you're really like, oh, he missed his gap read on this play. He missed, he overran this play. He whiffed on the tackle here. He didn't get off a block here. So I think from a consistency standpoint, Keanu's been a much more consistent player. He's, some of his lows have been a little bit lower than Deion Jones has been. But I think overall this season, I don't think it's that close. Not to say Deion Jones has played very well this year. He has a lot of good things this year. But I do think there are still some minor things that sort of get masked because, he has that pick six or a couple of pick sixes this year. And so people, you don't notice, on the next drive where he's out of his gap and it leads to like a 7-yard run. Now, is that a big deal? No, it's not. But it's like small little things that add up over time that when you have that sort of inconsistency, I think it's one of the reasons why the defense hasn't played particularly that well this year. Not to put it all on Debo or anything like that, but I think it adds up. And so I think Keanu has overall had a better season. Your homie Brian asks, what was your favorite all-time Falcons moment, and do you want jerseys back full time?
That kick that Morton Anderson made in 1998 is my all-time favorite Atlanta Falcons moment. Or sorry, it was early 1999. The one that sent them to the Super Bowl. All-time favorite. Will always be my favorite moment until the Falcons win the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the obvious answer. I'll sit here. Other than that, I was so young. I was in high school, so I wasn't that young. But it's so long ago that I don't really remember. I remember being happy, but I don't really remember it that well. Like the moment I can remember a little bit more clearly, I can remember the happiest day I was being a Falcon fan. It was the day I found out that we traded up number 1 to get Michael Vick. That was a big day. Now I know Vick.
Wasn't that your first day?
What?
Wasn't that your first day?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to.
I know Vic, doesn't sit too well with a lot of people, but I think people have sort of tried to write him out of Falcons history. I think, at least those first 3 or 4 years that he was here, were some of the best years of being a Falcon fan. So he was my favorite player for many of those years, and it was a big day. It was a big day because it felt like after several years of watching this team go to the Super Bowl and then basically be terrible for the next 3 seasons, having a little bit of hope back in the organization and the franchise was a big day. Matt Ryan, in terms of great draft days, when we drafted Matt Ryan, that was another big day for me. Unlike most Falcon fans, I was a big fan of Matt Ryan, that pick. And I won't say I knew he was going to be good, but I knew he was going to be good. So that was another big day. And yeah, do I want black jerseys back full time? Sure. Great. Always love the Falcons black.
I mean, whatever. I don't care. Just wear a Falcon jersey.
Andrew Schauweiler asks, do you think the Falcons will have any interest in Deshaun Jackson, or do you think Gabriel can do just as much?
I mean, I'd rather just have Gabriel.
Okay.
It's cheaper, and I think he can do just as much.
Okay.
And he's about 6 years younger.
Okay. Look, I think from a financial standpoint, it does make sense to have Taylor Gabriel, but, let's not get it twisted. Like Deshaun Jackson on a good day is one of the 10 best receivers in the NFL.
Yeah, but Deshaun Jackson on a good day is also a headache in the locker room that you don't want to deal with.
No, I get that. So, I understand, there's a lot of baggage with Deshaun Jackson, but, when he asked, do you think Gabriel can do just as much? No, I don't think, on Taylor Gabriel's best day, he's not one of the 10 best receivers in the NFL. So no, I don't think he can do just as much. But in terms of not going, like, Jackson's what, like 30 something now? He's up there. He came in the league in 08. So he's up there, about the same age as, I think it was like 20 when he came in the league. So, 28, 29-ish. So he's getting up there in age. He's had dealt with hamstring injuries, and he's got a little bit of a knucklehead factor, and he's costly. So would I think it's the smartest move to go out and pay all this money for Deshaun Jackson? No. But do I think it would make the team a whole lot better? Yeah, I think it would. It'd make them a whole lot better than they are with Mohamed Sanu as the number 2 receiver. But is it a move that the Falcons need to make? No, probably not. Andrew asks, do you think the offense will be more explosive next year?
I definitely think so. Especially if they can get a right guard who can pass block.
No, actually, I don't think the Falcons' offense is going to be. Aren't they like the most explosive offense in the league right now?
All right, so it may not be more explosive than it is now. I'm just being optimistic here. All right.
Fair enough. Look, I don't fault you for saying that. I'm just saying, like, if you're number one, the chances of you being number one again and even better at number one is probably low. I mean, it's possible. I'm not going to sit here and say no, they won't be explosive because they're too explosive now, but chances are likely that they will probably not be able to generate as many explosive plays next year as they were, but they still could probably be one of the most explosive teams in the league.
As long as Julio Jones, Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman, Taylor Gabriel, and Austin Hooper are on the roster, they will be a much more explosive team than they've been pre-2016. Yeah. I think that'll be fair to say. They may not be number one again. They may go down from 73, where I've got them right now, explosive plays like 65 at the same point. But, I mean, that's fine, especially if the defense ends up being way better.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew S., would you guys take Norv Turner as the OC if Shanahan leaves?
No. That's just so completely different of an offense. Honestly, if you had to bring anybody in that you could bring in, you got to go with the same kind of tree. You got to go with the same kind of guy. I mean, there's not really any true quarterbacks coaches that you can just steal and make him your offensive coordinator. The one guy that might make sense would be Marty Mornhinweg, but he's an offensive coordinator up in Baltimore. And then, I mean, there's just not really anybody out there. At least not yet. Not until people start firing their staffs. I mean, if you can steal Greg Knapp, do it. But I don't think you're going to steal Greg Knapp.
Yeah, I mean, look, I like Norv Turner as a coach. I think the problem is, as Scott said, it's a little too different. I think the main issue isn't necessarily the skilled position players, it's the offensive line. I think Jake Matthews has really found a home in the zone blocking scheme, and moving him back to sort of a more power-oriented man blocking scheme wouldn't be ideal. He can play it, obviously. Alex Mack can obviously play. Ryan Schrader can obviously play it. We've seen those guys play in a different blocking scheme and be good. I think the problem is now you're putting yourself in a position, okay, well, now you got to go out and get 2 new guards, which I know a lot of people want the team to do anyway. So, I wouldn't be exactly thrilled if we went out and got Norv Turner, but I do feel like there's going to be a little bit more of a personnel adjustment, and you would potentially have a little bit of a decline before you can get good again for however long it takes for you to make those adjustments. Andrew asks, what do you think it would take for Shanahan not to leave anytime soon?
The Rams is his only legitimate coaching option.
Yeah, I mean, look, LA's open right now. San Diego could potentially come open. Cincinnati could potentially come open. Jacksonville's probably definitely going to come open. The Jets might come open. Buffalo, there's a chance they could come open. Green Bay, there's a chance they could come open if they miss the playoffs. I'm trying to look at other teams.
Green Bay won't come open.
Yeah, I would doubt. There was a point earlier this season where I said that was a decent possibility, but yeah, I mean, other than that, I don't look at these teams. I think San Diego's the ideal job. If you want to be a head coach, you want to coach the Chargers next year. Of those teams, I think whether Shanahan leaves, we'll have to see. But my assumption is with Shanahan, he's going to look for a job that may not necessarily have an established quarterback, but at least has the means to get an established quarterback, and he's not going to be stuck in quarterback purgatory for the next 3 or 4 years. So it's going to be either a team that has an option right now or is picking in the top 2 or 3 picks, and which doesn't, I think, San Francisco, Chip Kelly should stick around for another year. Hugh Jackson should stick around in Cleveland. So I don't know who's got the 3rd pick. Jacksonville, I guess, if they're going to take a quarterback or something. But
it just hit me who I would want as a offensive coordinator if Shanahan leaves. Doug Marrone.
Okay.
He was the New Orleans offensive coordinator in 2006 to 2008 when they were putting up 6,000 yards a year and they were leading the NFL in scoring. His scheme is basically zone blocking, gap blocking, running game, basically what the Falcons run now, and then a lot of play action, a lot of combo routes. Basically, he runs a Shanahan-style offense. More of a Mike than a Kyle, but still a Shanahan-style offense.
Yeah. In terms of keeping Shanahan here, like I don't really think there's anything that you can do to keep him here other than just hope a good opportunity doesn't come along. I think one of the reasons he hooked up with Dan Quinn because he wanted to get a head coaching job, and he thought Dan Quinn was a good way of doing that. Now, whether that happens in 2017, we'll have to see. But I think eventually, assuming that the Falcons' offense, doesn't go back into the tank, eventually he's going to get an opportunity that he's going to be willing to not be willing to pass up, and eventually he's going to be gone. So I just think at this point, it's probably a safer assumption to assume it's inevitable that he's going to leave at some point. Hopefully it's 2018 or 2019 as opposed to 2017, but we'll have to see. Dirty Birds 45S, what are your expectations for next year?
Let's get through this year first.
Yeah, I mean, my expectations will change a lot depending on what happens at the end of this year. I guess right now my expectations are we will be a good team and we'll make the playoffs. Those are that's been my expectations the last 2 years, so I don't see why that would change next year.
Let's put it this way. The schedule should be a lot easier next year than what it was this past year.
Yeah, we play the AFC East and the AFC North next year.
Yeah. So, I mean, New England, that's going to be a tough game. And, AFC East and NFC North. New England's a tough game. Green Bay's a tough game. Minnesota's a tough game. Outside of those, you got Chicago, Detroit. I mean, Detroit's a tough game. So, I mean, the NFC North is going to be tough. AFC East is New England and then a bunch of schmucks. Then you probably get Dallas if Atlanta wins the division, and then NFC West is who? Seattle. So got to go back to Seattle next year, which will just suck. Hopefully Seattle loses out and someone else wins that division, but that ain't happening because that whole division's already sucked.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about playing those divisions, the AFC East in particular, is hopefully we're not going to be facing the caliber of defenses like we were facing this year in the AFC West.
God damn, the AFC West has good defense.
And, we'll have to see what Buffalo's defense is like. We'll have to see if the Jets' defense rebounds. But, Miami and New England, not to say that their defenses are bad, but it's not as if they're like, oh, my God, I'm so afraid of Chris Long and Kiko Alonso or whoever the heck. I don't even know who's on their teams. So, my expectations for next year is we'll be good and we'll make the playoffs. All right, guys. That is our show for tonight. Sorry for my technical difficulties. I want to give a shout out to Sammy Logan, who was supposed to be our guest tonight, but to his own technical difficulties, he was unable to join us. We'll try to get Sammy on the flip side. If you guys want to send in your mailbag questions, you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can tweet at the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC. You can hit me up. I'm at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Scar988. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher. You can find our archives at ProFootballCentral.com and a host of other great shows that cover the NFL. And we'll be back next week to talk about this 49ers game and prepare for the Christmas Eve game against the Carolina Panthers.